In this video, we're going to talk about particle systems. So what is a particle system? Well, a particle system is simply a system that uses sprites, so 2D images, to represent more fluid-like objects that a mesh normally wouldn't be able to handle very well. So you can think of these as things like fire and smoke and even sometimes water. For example, like a river flowing, you might use particles, or going down a waterfall. These are all what particle systems are for. And the reason that they work so well is that because we're using such a simple object, so we're using a sprite, it's just made up of two triangles. And your graphics card today can draw, millions of triangles per second. And so adding a lot of these little small triangles isn't that expensive. And in addition, these can be optimized to use, like an array to keep track of all of the information. So you get a lot of like locality and temporal locality so that the particle systems can be rendered very quickly. Now in Unity, we can create a particle system pretty easily. So if I just go to Game Object and I say, go to Effects and then Particle System, you'll see that I immediately get a particle system, and it's sort of just a generic setup. Notice that I have my scene set up here so I can actually see these sprites, so I can see that they're actual quads. And the textures that are used in particle systems usually have a transparent aspect to them. One of the reasons that they are drawn so quickly is because we can just assume they're always facing the camera, so we don't have to deal with any kind of rotations on them. And the textures are going to be transparent, but they're sort of drawn on top of everything, so we don't have to worry about, some occlusion issues. So we get nice performance out of it. And as you can see here, we're using a very simple texture that's bright in the middle, that's solid, and then it's transparent behind it. And to make that clear, what I can do is set up another object on here. So I can go to create 2D object, and I can then select a sprite that I can put on there, and then I can take this object and we can make it really big. And then if I go back to my particle system, it'll start simulating again, and you can see that the transparency, and I can see the objects behind it. So what does it look like in the game? Well, one of the nice things about Unity is that it's running the particle system at all times. And so if I go over to my game tab, I can see what that particle system is going to look like. But there's one thing that you want to pay attention to, and that is that your particle systems are really 3D objects. So as we've talked about before, in Unity, when we're making 2D games, everything is still running in 3 dimensions in the background. We're just sort of ignoring one of those dimensions by using what's called an orthographic camera. And if we look at our camera, we can see that it's set, to be orthographic here. And so even though, we see it like that, if we were to go and click on our 2D setting here, and then we click on our particle system so we can see it simulated, we can see that as we move around the scene, those particles, they're always facing the camera. And so even though we're, almost there's a very small slice of the planet sprite, our particles are still in 3D. And so we have to pay attention to that, especially with the way that the emitters work and the way the particles are fired off. These are shooting off into 3-dimensional space. And so you want to make sure that your orientation of your particle system and so on and so forth is pointing in the right direction. You'll notice this when you create your particle systems and you try to put them in your game and maybe you don't see them, or maybe you see a weird version of them. Then you should definitely check the 3D orientation of your particle system to make sure that it's spitting out particles in the direction that you're expecting, so along the XY axis, and not directly towards the Z axis, for example. Now, the particle system itself is really a component that sits on your game object. So just like, when I went in over here and created my particle system from my game object menu, I could just, take my new sprite, for example. I can say add component, and I can say particle system, and we'll see that there's a particle system component there. And it just gets added to the object, and then there's a bunch of pieces to it. Now, particle systems are pretty complicated, as you can see, and all of these are little areas that can be opened up. So if I click on them, I have more settings for any one of these for setting up, different effects, whether it's sub-emitters or, velocity over lifetime. I can change all of these by setting up, different settings in the component itself. So that's what we're really going to do in the next sequence of videos that go over particle systems, is just sort of look at what do these mean and how do we set these up properly for Unity so we can get particle systems that do the kinds of things you'd like them to do.